format here, I think of Harry like a jazz virtuoso. You don't want to ask him to come in and play a concert. Instead, you want to throw him a few notes and let him rip and hear him jam. So that's what we're going to do. Throw him a few questions, and I'll pose the first few, and then open it up to the audience for questions. So here's question number one.
Question one.
From Dartmouth, graduated in 2011 to 538. Take us through that journey.
Yeah, so let's see, graduated on a cool June day. Conan O'Brien was the speaker. I go back to New York and have no job whatsoever. Didn't have anything lined up. I found myself applying for jobs, was unsuccessful in some of them. I hope some of those people regret their decision, at least somewhat. But you'll have to ask them. Although I did once appear on TV with the guy who turned me down, and there was a part of me that wanted to wink towards the camera, but I thought better of it. I basically was doing nothing except getting inebriated on Fridays at the Eastchester Fish Market in Scarsdale, New York, on espresso martinis. And I kept writing though, I kept blogging, and this was something my mom told me to keep doing, keep getting my material out there, and God bless that woman, she was right. I ended up writing a piece that apparently caught the eye of someone at The Guardian, which of course is the British newspaper, but they were starting a branch in New York. And they needed someone to help them guide their 2016 coverage, or someone to write for them during that. So I wrote a freelance piece on the effect of the economy, how that affects presidential vote patterns. They thought it was a decent enough piece. They then asked me to do some part-time work for them, which I did. And then after doing part-time work, after 3 months, they had me full-time. Apparently I didn't get enough wrong that year for them to fire me. And then I continued on through 2013, and then Nate Silver at 538 came a knocking. We had lunch. I remember it was at a seafood or fish restaurant, and he had a hamburger. And go figure. And then I caught on at 538 and have been there since December of 2013. And I've written on politics, on elections, the occasional sports column, as well as the occasional weather column, which I enjoy very much so, and have done, obviously, media appearances, whether they be radio or television, especially this past cycle, where I guess my put-em was just too much for them not to ignore.
So the 2016 election was a conundrum for a lot of people, and you're in good company in maybe not accurately predicting the outcome of the election. So we can cue the video.
This is from 2015. This is before any voting took place, but still. Can we hit play? Do I need to go up there and hit play? Because I can walk.
I can do it.
Ah, see, we are having movement already. How fun is this?
If this doesn't work, you're going to have to reenact.
This should be a play button. There it is. Light, camera, action. Very well put together. How's everyone doing? Nice to hear. Nice to see.
I know. What's up, Haynes? It's been a really tough year, guys, for predictors like myself. I screwed up a lot. On August 11th, I wrote, "The Bernie Sanders surge appears to be over." A few days later, he jumped in the lead in New Hampshire. In early February, 3 of my favorites for the GOP nomination were Jeb Bush, followed by Scott Walker, and Rick Perry wasn't too far behind. Scott Walker, first Republican to drop out of the race. Ted Cruz was all the way down at 1%. What the heck was I thinking? In late January, I said that Bobby Jindal was probably not going to enter the race for president. He did enter, although he probably shouldn't have. On September 25th, I wrote an article on how Bobby Jindal could still win Iowa. And Bobby Jindal, who is he again? Harry. In early May, I wrote that Chris Christie's lanes to the Republican nomination were pretty much all closed. I that one up. Here's a headline I wrote: "Why Donald Trump's not a real candidate," in one chart. 2 good reasons not to take the Donald Trump surge seriously. Was the second debate the beginning of the end for Donald Trump? Wrong. Wrong again. Mother. On December 15th, I predicted that Donald Trump would drop out of the race before my company. Better luck next year, Henry. Everything right.
So what did you miss?
So I think that video kind of hints at a key difference that I think I've been making throughout as I talk with different people about where I and perhaps the data journalism or the political math people screwed up. There's a big difference between the primary and the general election. That video was taken obviously before the primary took place. So very clearly in the primary there was a massive screw up on my part and a lot of other people's parts. Where when Donald Trump enters the race, and I think it was June 15, 2015, comes down that escalator and not a single one of us really took him seriously. And the question is why? Well, one of the big reasons why we did not take him seriously was he didn't look like someone who had won a Republican or Democratic nomination in recent years, right? Most people who win have elected office experience of at least some type. Donald Trump obviously had no types. He had barely run for office, kind of, sort of, in 2000 when he was running for the Reform Party presidential nomination. And we at 538 subscribe to a theory known as the party decides. There's more to it than perhaps I'll get to right here, but essentially it's that party actors help guide voters to who should be selected for the nomination. And when I say party actors, I mean elected officials, governors, senators, members of the House. But I also mean interest group leaders, say the NRA for the Republican Party, or perhaps NARAL on the Democratic side. And Donald Trump had pretty much no support from any of these party actors. And so we thought Donald Trump, no chance, right? This guy just doesn't look. But I think that there were a few fault lines in our thought process. Number one, if you think about it, no one like Donald Trump had really ever run before, right? No one who had been the host of The Apprentice, no one who had cameoed in Home Alone 2. None of these people, no one looked like him, they simply didn't. And when you're dealing with a modern primary process, that is where primary winners are people who win nominations who decided through caucuses and primaries, the sample size is in fact very, very small. And when sample sizes are small and you haven't seen something before, it could mean simply that we haven't gone through that evolution yet to allow something like that to occur. And we didn't have anybody like Trump. And I think we should have been more cautious, and I should have been more cautious at recognizing that we had a small sample size and something strange, something out of the quote-unquote ordinary could happen. So that was the deal with the primary. But that's very different from what occurred in the general election, okay? In the general election, if you look at the 538 odds going throughout, we gave Donald Trump a chance of winning. Now, it depended on which particular day, but it basically balanced between 10 and 50%. And right at the very end of the campaign, it was right about 30%. I believe it was 29 on our final day of the forecast. So to me, 30% chance things happen all of the time, right? You flip a coin in the air twice, you're going to land on heads twice, 25% of the time. Well, to me, that happens quite frequently. I guess the question is whether or not people like myself, at least at our website, were able to report in such a manner that reflected that uncertainty. And I'm not necessarily sure that we did. Perhaps it was the tone that we took, perhaps it was the articles that we wrote around the model that we didn't necessarily do, or perhaps in some of the media appearances that I and others on the website had, maybe we didn't necessarily put forth in the manner that we should have, the uncertainty. But I will say, in closing on this particular point, that if you look at our forecast compared to a lot of other websites and the amount of caution that we had, at least in the general election, there's very little that I would have taken back, at least in terms of the general. It's different from the primary, but in the general election I have far fewer regrets.
So 70% chance of something is not a result that would be publishable in an academic article, usually. Not the kind of thing that in a jury trial would say be enough evidence to convict someone of a crime. 70% is not anywhere close to beyond a reasonable doubt or a high probability of occurring in most other audiences. But still, the polls had, and most of the polls had, Hillary Clinton with a lead nationwide and in states like Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, even after the Comey letter, in the final day or two of the campaign. What did the polls get wrong?
Well, I think you kind of hit on it a little bit, that we need to be careful in separating out the national polls from the state polls. Hillary Clinton got more votes nationwide than Donald Trump. That's not the way we select the president. He went fair and square in that manner. But the national polls, depending on which average you look at, basically had a Hillary Clinton lead of about 3 to 4 percentage points, and she won by 2.1 percentage points. That's a very small error. That's actually smaller than the error that we had in the 2012 election. It just so happened that the person who was winning in 2012 in the Electoral College in the polls also won the Electoral College in the end result, so people don't remember that error. So the national polls, fine, whatever. Those are good. I don't, there's not much we can say about that. It's obviously the state polls where things screwed up, and that's a whole other question. As you noted, there were states like Wisconsin, like Pennsylvania, like Michigan, where Hillary Clinton led in the vast majority of the polls in those states, and indeed, nearly in, say, the state of Wisconsin, 100% of the polls. Why were those state polls wrong? Well, in the state, it really does depend on the case of the state. In Pennsylvania, the polls were fairly close, okay, whatever. But in Wisconsin, the polls were way off. What happened? Well, if you look at the polling errors by state, you do in fact see that it does seem that in the states that had a higher percentage of the vote that was made up of white non-college graduates, that's where the vote was off the most. Question is, why is that? Was it one, these polls didn't have enough of those voters? Two, those voters were lying. Three, it could be, remember, in polls were sometimes weighting up groups to match their percentage of the overall population. Maybe the people who were answering the polls from white non-college graduates weren't representative of the vote. Or four, it could just be that there was late movement within the very last weekend that the polls didn't pick up. What we do know is that it probably wasn't the case that people were afraid to admit that they were voting for Trump. It's probably not number two. The reason I say that is because if you look at the Senate races as well, you do see that the Republican Senate candidates across the board also outperformed their polling. So to me, you could say, hey, maybe people were ashamed to admit that they were voting for Donald Trump, but were they also ashamed to admit that they were voting for Pat Toomey or Ron Johnson or Rob Portman? Probably not. These are people who perhaps some of which are more conservative than others that I just mentioned, but none of them are known as people who you might have some, shy away from admitting support from. So it really, we're still diagnosing it, obviously, but clearly something happened. I'll add one little thing to close out this point, and that is the average error in the state polls, while perhaps it was a little larger than it has been over the average of the past years since 1972, it wasn't that much larger. In 1980, for instance, the polls were off by double or triple, the state polls were off by double or triple on average what they were in 2016. It just so happened that Ronald Reagan, the winner that year, was leading in the final polls by a small percentage. So it's a case that the winner didn't flip, so I don't think people remember the error nearly as much as they'll remember this one.
One final question from me before we turn it over to questions from you, and that is, how has the Trump administration, or the past few weeks, changed the way that you work at 538?
Take a long drink for that. Means that you don't get as much sleep. Means that you got to be on call 24 hours a day. You don't know when Trump's going to tweet something or more than that sign an executive order that changes the way that we do business in this country in a profound way. So last weekend, I was writing on the Trump executive order regarding immigration and refugees. I think after the election, we were really hoping to do some deeper dives, and we'll still do that. But the fact is, when there's a newsmaker every day, you have to keep up with the news. The readers are interested. But I would argue more so than anything else, it has made us become more interested in policy with a capital P. That is that we want to help explain what is going on in a manner that you can't just get from the first day publication. We're more of what we call a second day publication. That is, we recognize what's going on and then we we sit with it and then we help try to explain it. And I think that we're going to try and do a lot of things revolving around policy, revolving, say, around the Affordable Health Care Act, revolving around immigration, revolving around the Supreme Court, revolving around Congress in general. We put up a new infographic, a new interactive on which Congress people vote with Donald Trump the most and which one vote with him the least. And that has been more popular than pretty much any interactive that we've put up. People are just really interested in policy in ways that I've never seen them interested in, and especially interested, if we're being honest with ourselves, in the coast, in towns like Hanover that were overwhelmingly for Hillary Clinton. People, I think a lot of people are worried, a lot of people are scared, but a lot of people are also interested in wondering what they can do and interested in the news in general.
So with that, questions from the audience? Yes, right here.
Speaker. Michael Moore made the assertion that Hillary lost in Michigan by 10,000 votes, but there were 90,000 votes where people voted down slate but left the top blank. Was that the case largely across the country, and how does that affect polling?
Well, sure. There were a lot of ballots that were left blank, and I think we knew that heading into the election that there was real dissatisfaction with the candidates. You know, I think if you would ask Republicans, and perhaps we'll get into this a little bit later, if you would ask Democrats, excuse me, in June of 2015, if the Republican nominee, you'll get this deal, the Republican nominee will be Donald Trump, and he'll be the least liked candidate, major party nominee candidate of all time, would you take that deal? Well, I would think they would have, and they did get that deal, and he ends up winning anyway. Well, why was that? It was because Hillary Clinton was perhaps the second least liked candidate of all time. And when you have that type level of dissatisfaction with the two major party candidates, what we saw in the polls was a much higher amount of undecideds heading into the election. We also saw a much higher percentage who said that they were going to vote third party than at any point in the last 20 years, dating back to Ross Perot. And if you look at the returns by state, you do see, for instance, in Florida, you know, about 1% of the vote, you know, of these people who voted up or voted down ballot but didn't vote up ballot, and that was the difference. Now, Michigan was a particular case where the final result was so close, 0.1 percentage points about, that perhaps it could have been that those people who would have voted blank would have maybe been more likely to vote for Hillary Clinton than for Donald Trump. But we don't know that to be for sure. We do know, for instance, the exit poll showed that when you asked the two-way race versus, say, the multi-candidate race, in fact, it showed that Donald Trump may have, in fact, gained a little bit of support. And then most of the other people would have said that they would have stayed home. But I think that this is a real case that you can't beat barely something with nothing, or you can't just hope that because the other party puts up a candidate that's hated that you could put up anybody. Now, I think that we can agree or disagree on Hillary Clinton's qualifications. I think she was well qualified to be President of the United States, at least in the way that we normally recognize qualifications. But I don't think there's much disagreement that there were a lot of people who disliked Hillary Clinton. And unfortunately for the Democratic Party, there were enough of those in the states that were necessary that ended up killing her candidacy and killing the Democrats' hopes of stopping Donald Trump.
Another question, right here.
I'm wondering, looking at, you know, it's a little early obviously, but looking at 2020, who do you think are the front runners for the Democratic nomination? And will Donald Trump face a primary challenge?
I see we have a glutton for punishment here. Look, Donald Trump's already filed for re-election far earlier than pretty much anyone has ever filed for re-election with the FEC. So he's going. We'll see if he makes it there, but he's going. On the Democratic side, look, it's early days yet. I'm reminded back in 2006, one of the front runners for the Republican nomination was George Allen, who is the senator from Virginia. And George Allen kind of ran into a roadblock when he lost re-election in 2006. So early front runners don't necessarily make nominees. That being said, I think that there are a bunch of people who are obviously on my list on the Democratic side, at least early on. Kirsten Gillibrand, who by her record of voting in Congress, voting pretty much against every single thing that Donald Trump puts up, clearly has her idea, her eye on the ball. I think you could also be looking at Cory Booker, who's obviously the senator from New Jersey. I think you could be looking at Montana's governor, whose name escapes me right now. I think you could potentially be looking at Jay Inslee, who's the governor from Washington, who basically gave a non-answer to that question. And obviously you could be looking at someone like Joaquin Castro, you know, down in Texas. So there are a bunch of people that we could be looking at, but I think the Democratic Party overall is going to be facing a very interesting question as to what type of candidate that they want to put up, what type of candidate, what type of appeal do they want. Do they want to try and make up the ground that they lost among white voters without a college degree in the Midwest? Do they try and want to ramp up minority turnout, perhaps by nominating another African American candidate or perhaps a Latino candidate? Or maybe they want to try something entirely new. Maybe they want to try something out in the West and, you know, build a map around, you know, doing well in the Northeast, the West, maybe try and, you know, add on Colorado, pick up Arizona, Nevada, and try and build a new electoral map and add on Florida. And I think there are a lot of questions that we still don't know about where this Democratic Party is going. One thing I'd be interested, perhaps will give us a leading indicator, is the 2018 midterms insofar as let's see where they make gains in the House. And they'll probably make gains in the House because that's what normally happens. The party out of the White House makes gains in the House during a midterm election. But where those gains are made may give us an idea of where they think they can pick up strength as they head into 2020.
You didn't mention Tim Kaine,
I didn't.
vice presidential nominee on the Democratic
Didn't
side.
mention Tim.
Oh, he did?
I know, I didn't mention it. No.
Does he think he's not in the top set now?
He himself has said as much, and to be perfectly honest, I think Tim Kaine is a very nice man, who's a very smart man, who doesn't have that much charisma, if we're being honest with ourselves. Probably a little bit too moderate for a base that isn't looking for that right now. And, you know, failing vice presidential candidates don't end up doing particularly well when they run for the White House. I mean, I can think of Dan Quayle as an example, who ran in 2000, really didn't go anywhere. That was obviously George H.W. Bush's vice presidential candidate, and he obviously was the vice president. You can think of somebody along the lines of John Edwards. You could think of, well, he had other problems. You can think of someone like Bob Dole, who was obviously, what's his name? So Jack Kemp. Kemp failed before that, but Bob Dole was a VP candidate for Gerald Ford in 1976 and ran in 80, and then in 88 it wasn't until his third time's the charm in 1996 that he ended up winning. So I'm not really looking at, I think Tim Kaine's future is probably in the Senate, unless he wants to go back and try and run for governor, because my understanding is that you can run in Virginia for governor twice, they just can't be consecutive terms.
Question back.
So you talked about how the LA Times USC poll had an internal House bias effect towards Trump. Do you think that there's any type of vindication for the approach by the USC poll in the aftermath of this election, or do you think that was still very flawed in terms of its polling, how it disagreed with the rest of the pollsters?
Well, my understanding was that they were trying to project the national popular vote, and they had Donald Trump winning in the final score by what, 2 or 3 percentage points? 2 points. 2 points, and I don't believe he won the national popular vote unless, you know, there were those 3 to 5 million legal votes that he claims that were passed. But, you know, maybe look, Donald Trump likes to say certain things that fact checkers have shown to be untrue. So, you know, no, look, I'm a big fan of innovation, and I'm a big fan of trying new things. I'm a big fan of panels such as, you know, the USC LA Times. I was not a fan of the way that they weighted that panel, and the USC LA Times poll is a great example of how weighting can go awry insofar as that, you know, if you are representing a portion of the population that's very difficult to poll, well, you're going to weight up whoever you have that represents that part of the population. And so they had a young African American who was, I think, was 19 years old, who for whatever reason was probably the most pro-Trump young African American in the nation. So whenever his came in, all of a sudden Trump's share of the African American vote shot up. You could literally see it like every 7 days or whatever. So I think that poll had some problems, but I think that I hope they don't shut down. I just hope that perhaps that they can fix what's going on. And I respect that they tried to put out that product, but clearly it didn't end up working out in the end.
Let's explain poll weighting for just a second.
Sure.
Suppose
You can explain it.
have 1,000-person sample and you expect that the population is half male, half female. You get your sample back and you have 750 women and 250 men. So what do? Well, you count every man as 2 men, so now you have 500, and you count every woman as 2/3 of a woman, so that brings the 750 down to 500. Most polling houses weight by gender, race, education, a lot weight by party identification. And those weights, if all the polls are using erroneous weights, or making up weights based on party identification, if you take the variation in polls and kind of collapse into a sameness that then masks the true variation that you have in the polls. So every poll weights according to its own method, and a lot of times, I think with the Dornsife poll at USC, the weights weren't always clear.
Yeah, they weren't what they should have been. Something was funky.
Question over here. Yes.
Again, the West Coast is an interesting land.
So you sort of touched on this when you mentioned this when you were talking about how 538 had given Donald Trump a 30% chance of winning, right? But in the days after the election, people in discussions have been like, oh, 538 was totally wrong. So, but that to me indicates just a fundamental lack of understanding of how probability works, like you said. So in the future, how do you and the rest of 538 plan on contextualizing these numbers for people who might, assume that 70% means it's guaranteed?
Sure, it's a great question. I would say, number one, obviously we've had discussions about that, of how we would try and better communicate probability and uncertainty. I mean, look, you can only write so many articles the weekend before the election if Donald Trump is just a normal polling error away from winning this election. And you hope that people will understand that. The New York Times has tried to do stuff like the chance of someone making a field goal from 37 yards out. As a Bills fan, I've made the joke numerous times. Missed field goals are not something that I like to assign the probability any one way or another. We've missed far too many of them. But I think we might try and do something along the lines of, the heads, twice in a row, so on and so forth. That happens 25% of the time. Hopefully, perhaps in our own graphics, we'll try and represent it better. But, I think Nate himself has said, I probably received too much credit in 2008 and 2012 and not enough credit this time around. They kind of balanced out. But I think that what I hope is this election may in fact inform people or understand the probability and help them really, really grasp it, right? Because it's one thing, even for myself, to see, Donald Trump has a 30% chance of winning. But it's another to actually really picture that happening. Like, I still remember, I knew mathematically that it could occur. But as returns were coming in, I was like, what in the hell is this? We're doing this? Apparently we are. Okay. It was just, it was like such a deviation from the normal. But I hope that we'll be able to come up with new ways in the interactive to show that. We'll talk about it more. And I'm also hoping that the audience itself, or the readership, now has a better understanding, especially some of those who may not grasp probability as well. Among those who did, it was much less of a problem, especially if you were reading across websites. As I like to say, we were the least wrong compared to the others.
So there's another question over here, and then we'll move back this way.
I want to go back to what you said about the two very unpopular candidates running. The question I have is, not too long before she started running for president, she was the Secretary of State, and she left that office with very high approval ratings. And it has been a mystery to me, particularly amongst avid Democrats, how that very high rating in such a very short period of time crashed to the low it was showing up in the election.
I think this is a great point, and that is Hillary Clinton always seems to be her most popular when she's not running for office, whether that be Secretary of State or whether that be in between the time, she won her first Senate term and then her second Senate win, she was kind of higher and then she crashed again. I mean, the obvious explanation is she's not a very good campaigner, but I don't think that that's necessarily true. Remember, Hillary Clinton has gotten more votes in every race that she's running than the other candidate, or the next leading candidate. She got more votes in the 2008 Democratic primary, if you count it in a certain way. She got more votes in both of her runs for Senate. She obviously got more votes than Bernie Sanders, and she got more votes than Donald Trump got. But I think that there were a few things that occurred. Number one, obviously, when you're Secretary of State, it's a nonpartisan position for the most part, so people tend to like you better. So it was natural that her favorability ratings would drop a little bit. But clearly they fell through the floor, and they even dropped among Democrats. The question is why? I think that she lost a lot of ground among a certain type of Democrat who did not like the idea that she was giving those speeches to Goldman Sachs. I think there's always been some belief that Hillary Clinton was hiding something, whether or not that's right or wrong. She had some sort of trust issue. And that you kind of saw itself manifest in the general election, right? They automatically with Comey, oh my God, you literally saw her numbers drop overnight both times with Comey. Remember, he announces first in July when he says we're not going to bring charges, and then he writes the letter to Congress and you see her numbers drop again. And if you look at like the Google trend line as well with WikiLeaks, which is all about trust, that was searched a ton on Twitter, on Google during the month of October. And that's in fact when the exit polls, if you believe these numbers, and there's some reason to believe and some reason not, but I think they're reliable enough to say this, more people who decided in October decided against Hillary Clinton than in any month during the campaign, and that was when WikiLeaks was being discussed the most, despite the fact that Hillary Clinton, by most standards, won overwhelmingly in debates. It just didn't seem that those debates mattered to people. So, you know, I don't know. I don't know if there's a perfect satisfactory answer, but it is definitely the case that Hillary Clinton did some things that probably hurt herself, and it was also just some natural decline that some people, for whatever reason, just aren't in love with her, or just didn't like her, or just looking for any reason to dislike her.
We're right behind, over here, in 8 minutes. Yes.
Hi, so I guess this was sort of my first election as an adult, but it seemed to me there was a lot, at least this cycle, there was a lot more people using social media, a lot more people owning smartphones instead of landlines. And I guess my question is generally, how has such changes in behavior affected polling, and in what ways was that lacking this election?
Obviously, we've taken on more social media now than we've ever had, at least in the sense of what we call social media. Though I kind of think that the newspapers at the turn of the 20th century, well, the yellow rags were kind of, were some form of their own type of social media. But I think there are a few things. Number one, people can get their news from wherever they want to get it, and they can hear whatever they want to hear. And this is on both sides. I was at a media panel. I was not on it. I was in the audience for last week or so at NYU, and there was some woman who clearly did not like Donald Trump, and she asked for the people on the panel in their own writing to tell her what was going on in right-wing media because she herself didn't want to read it. So, you know, I think people got the news diet that they wanted, and it helped confirm what they heard, and more than that, allowed people to believe the very worst about the other candidates. So there were a lot of people who just profoundly hated both candidates in a way that I don't think I've ever seen. And I think that's part of the reason why you might have seen the unpopularity of both candidates. But I think more than that, it helped to ensure that the mainstream media had perhaps less of an effect than it might otherwise have. So you had a candidate in Donald Trump who, according to the fact checkers, was not telling truths, right? He was telling a lot more falsehoods than, say, Hillary Clinton was telling. But I don't think that that message necessarily got across to a lot of people who might otherwise maybe be on the fence about Donald Trump, because simply put, that news just wasn't getting to them. So they just were like, oh, Donald Trump, whatever. And I finally note that I think social media helps to ensure that within our own social groups, we basically align. We have our Hillary Clinton, everyone who's for Hillary Clinton has, you know, their friends for Hillary Clinton, everyone who's for Donald Trump, you know, all of their friends for Donald Trump. Now, obviously, that's not the case across the board, right? But it is the case more so than any time I've ever seen in the polling where people are like, my friends are for my politics, and if they're not for my politics, I don't want to be their friends. I'm not sure that's the healthiest thing for our country, but it is what it is. In terms of social media's effect on the election, I mean, Donald Trump had a huge Twitter feed. I think he helped to make news on that. Most people are not on Twitter, but most people at least watch some form of media that reported on Donald Trump's Twitter. So he was able to shape the news in a way that I don't think anyone else has shaped it. Although I'll finally add on this, and somewhat related, is that no candidate since Jesse Jackson got more media attention than Donald Trump did, given how unpopular he was, the ratio. So the media, at least in the primary, despite what Donald Trump likes to argue, the media was really helping him out, and he took full advantage of it. It was a genius thing. He appeared on news stations all the time, was willing to go on. A lot of the Republican candidates, and Hillary Clinton wasn't, and he recognized media, I'm just going to throw everything. And Donald Trump believed all news was good news. Well, it worked out for him, at least in the end.
Right here.
So it seems like a fairly large feature of this campaign, this cycle, and even continuing now, was a change in and fragmentation of party unity, just among people who would have previously identified as Democrats or Republicans, not necessarily feeling like they are in line with their national parties anymore. So when you mentioned things like weighting by party affiliation and how 538 thinks about the party decides, how are these things changing, or how is 538's thinking on these things changing going forward, if at all?
Right, so I think there are a bunch of questions, and I should point out at the end of the day, over 90% of Republicans voted for Donald Trump and over 90% of Democrats voted for Hillary Clinton. But I will say that There are a lot of independents, although this year perhaps a smaller number than 2015, but we've been on the up climb. So there's clearly a lot of distrust of the two major parties or the leaders of those major parties. And that's part of the reason why I'm interested in what happens in Congress this year. I'm interested whether or not people are actually going to abide by who their leaders in what their leaders in Congress say to vote for, what Donald Trump says to vote for. Right now, Democrats are voting one way and Republicans are voting another, but let's give it a few months. In terms of the party decides and nomination processes, as I've mentioned before, usually I think of winning candidates being those in the center of the aisle right, and that if you're on the far end, then you're probably not going to be able to appeal to the voter in the middle. Left, right, center. This year, however, I would argue that Donald Trump really didn't match ideology as we normally think of it. Donald Trump makes different positions in different ways, infrastructure. From a Republican, what year is this? I don't even know. It felt like Fiorello Laguardia or something like that arguing for this. But he was on a different dimension, a second dimension. Some people might argue that that's about, authoritarianism. Some people, in fact, might argue it's about being an insider versus an outsider. Maybe the three dimensions, I'm not exactly sure. But revolving around the Democratic side especially, there was a real outsider push from Bernie Sanders. And I wouldn't have been surprised, I thought when I was watching, I said, oh, too far left to win a general election. But it could be that right now what voters are really interested in is something from outside the normal realms, and maybe more interested in an outsider candidate, and maybe someone, a vision like Sanders, could in fact take over the Democratic Party. I'm particularly interested in the chairman race for the Democratic National Committee to see, because if, let's say, a Keith Ellison wins, right? He's a pretty outsider candidate guy who's backed by Bernie Sanders. And if all of a sudden you're getting a Bernie Sanders backed candidate to win such an insider race as the Democratic National Committee chairman or chairperson, that may indicate some real changes within the party. But for right now, on the Democratic side, what we're seeing, at least in Congress, is not really much of a drop-off. We're seeing certainly a push from the grassroots to vote against these Trump nominees, but we're seeing a lot of unity. We're not seeing much of a breakdown. We are seeing Schumer in control of that caucus. So I haven't seen too much of a breakdown there. I'm more interested on the Republican side when all of a sudden things start getting a little dicey. If Trump's approval rating sticks at around 40% and you're heading towards a midterm election where usually the party out of the White House does fairly well, whether they're going to stick by Trump or you're going to start to see some fragmenting of that base. I'm not sure yet, but we'll have to wait and see.
Question over here. Questions over here on the side? Well, you're right in the middle.
Am I passing this over?
Several outlets, including the Huffington Post, criticized 538's analysis for quote-unquote skewing the polls in favor of Donald Trump in the run-up to the election.
Wow, what an article that was from them, right?
Could you speak to that aspect of your model and why you guys received criticism for it?
We received criticism because we told people what they didn't want to hear. That's why. I mean, I'm going to be honest with you right here, right now. Our readership, if you look at the demographics, and based upon the emails that I get, is read by more liberal-leaning people than conservative-leaning people, although we certainly have conservatives who read the website and respect the work that we do. And I think a lot of people saw it and didn't want to believe the numbers that we were putting up. How could it be possible that Donald Trump could win a presidential nomination? All of my friends are against him. Woo! So I think they saw that and couldn't believe it. Huffington Post had its own model with the pollster.com folks. I like Natalie Jackson, I like Ariel Levy Edwards, or is it Edwards Levy, whatever. But I like them. But the fact of the matter was that if you look at the model and the work that was put into it, and I'm not primarily responsible for the model, Nathaniel is, but I know the data that goes into that model, and I know that we took data going all the way back to 1972. We tested this model a lot of times in a lot of different ways, and we understood a few things. Number one, that the polls, the state polls recently, we perhaps were on a lucky streak in terms of how accurate they were. They aren't normally this accurate. Number two, we understood that errors, when they occurred in one state, often occurred in other states that looked like that state demographically. And I'm not sure that the other models did that as well as our model did. And so what you end up happening is we look like we're much more in favor of Donald Trump, when in fact it probably was that these other models were too certain, And when you have a writer at Huffington Post, I forget the author's name, Ryan something, I think. And when he looks at that, he thinks, oh, we're putting the finger on the scale. Why is our model? We have a business reason for doing that. Yeah, sure. The well-educated people who live in New York, you know, we really have a pro-Trump bias going. Give me a break.
Other questions? Go middle.
Since the election, I've heard a lot of news people and political commentators say, well, now I'm out of the prediction business. But I feel like they never really were in the prediction business. They were journalists. And the role of journalism is to inform the public so that we can make our decisions.
Yeah.
What do you see as the value in what you do in polling and all this data analytics?
Well, I want to answer the first part of your question that wasn't even a question first, and then I'll get to your real question. I think that there were a lot of people who didn't know what they were doing making predictions based upon what they saw, what they felt, and so on and so forth, and didn't have a formal model. And that was what I would argue perhaps is our greatest error in the primaries. We didn't really have a formal model when we were making all these declarations, you know, about Trump having no chance, so on and so forth. And we did that. We did have that in the general election. And I think our model presented uncertainty that was warranted. Well, now clearly it seems warranted, but that regular journalists perhaps didn't. And their strings don't lie in the prediction forecast. They aren't looking at the same things that we're looking at in the same mathematical ways. So I think it would be a great thing if they did what they did well and we do what we try to do well, right? In terms of what is, you know, why is it that predictions are good or bad? Look, I'm not going to tell you that the work that we do is more important than discovering, you know, that so-and-so has a scandal in one place or another. But I do think it's important to manage expectations. If, for instance, you know, if we showed that Donald Trump had a 0% chance of winning, and that was like the true, you know, universe that so on and so forth, and then after the election, Donald Trump, in fact, wins and wins by 5 or 6 or 7 percentage points. Well, one of two things might have happened in that situation. Number one, it could be that the polls were completely off. Or number two, in this hypothetical situation, it could be a sign that there was actual voter fraud. I think that polls before the election are actually a really good way of testing whether or not there is reason to believe that the actual result was untrusting, that we should go back and investigate it. More than that, though, you know, I think that's a hypothetical, so on and so forth. More than that, people want to read it. They want to read it, and it's interesting, and it's fun, and it gets people involved. People were more interested in this election, or more interested in what we were doing, than perhaps I've seen at any point at any time. And if, you know, if it takes someone to get more interested in politics, if the way that we get them more interested in civil affairs is through the prediction game, well, I think that's a good thing. I don't care necessarily how we do it as long as we get more people involved in politics. And if that's the way we do it, then great.
I'll add that each of the campaigns traditionally has had people who do what 538 does,
Yeah.
but behind the scenes, they won't reveal their data, and that drives campaign advertising and other things. So I think sites like 538 have done two things for us. Number one, they brought this out in the open for all of us to see. And number two is I think they put a lot of pressure on these pollsters and analysts within each of the campaigns, maybe even put a few out of business, or at least lower the fees that they can charge because 538 is doing it for free for all of us.
And let me add, I do know, for instance, at one point when we showed a closer race in Rhode Island for some reason, that the Hillary Clinton campaign decided to spend a little extra money there just to make sure, just to investigate whether or not there was any reason for that. Turns out there wasn't, though. Donald Trump did significantly better in Rhode Island than Mitt Romney did 4 years previous.
So we try to get some over here down in front.
So what are your thoughts on prediction market like Betfair or Predictit versus 538 statistical model, and specifically the volatility between the two projections?
Sure. So, you know, there are these prediction markets that essentially you put money down on. You say, I'm going to bet on so-and-so to win and such. And I would say, and you can do that in politics, you can do it in sports, so on. In terms of politics, I will point out that I've been a little disappointed, you know, I look at those things, okay? I look at them, you know, soon. But they're not part of our formal model. They're not. They got in just as much wrong, if not more wrong than we have, for instance, with the Brexit vote. I think that a lot of the reason why people think, you know, this is the funniest darn thing to me in the world. They say, oh, the polls were wrong at Brexit, therefore polling is broken and blah, 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 blah. In the final month of the campaign for the Brexit vote in England, there were more polls that said that people were going to vote to leave than vote to stay. But what happened was, number one, a big part of that was the prediction markets indicated that everyone was going to vote to stay, and so it became almost this common wisdom that was completely off. But I do think that the prediction markets, and the prediction markets to me really just reflect conventional wisdom. They really do. There are very few instances where the prediction markets say something where I'm completely shocked at. Perhaps it's a good gut check. I think when the prediction markets showed Donald Trump rising towards the first vote in Iowa, that perhaps was, wow, this could really happen. A lot of people think maybe there's some wisdom in the crowd. But I'll point out that after Trump lost in Iowa, he went right down to prediction markets. So I'm not sure how much they add, but you know, you want to go make some money, make a little bet, go ahead, be my guest. Nothing wrong with making money in this country. It is America after all.
In the back, there behind you.
Hi, I'm interested to hear about your experience at Dartmouth and how it might, what opportunities you had here that might have fed your interest in stats, politics, government, all of the above.
So this is the portion of the program where I do a paid ad for Dartmouth. You know, Dartmouth fulfilled all my dreams. Thank you. Look, I think there were a few things that Dartmouth did and helped out. Number one, you know, gave me room to, you know, try and figure out what exactly I was good at and figure out how to do it. So I took a lot of independent studies while I was here, and the professors were very helpful of that. They let me investigate things that I wanted to investigate. And more than that, professors across departments were willing to work with me to help hone my skill set. So, you know, I took a Women in Gender Studies course, was it Women in Gender Studies 18 or 19? It was about LGBT rights, whichever course it was exactly. One was Intro to it, and the other one was called Will and Grace. Right? Wow, how far we've come. And I wrote a paper, and I went to the professor and said, yeah, I'd like to write a paper about the gay vote in the Democratic primary in 2008, who actually won it, Barack Obama or Hillary Clinton. And he goes back and goes, fantastic, do whatever you want, great, 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 great. And in writing that paper, I've cited that paper before, in writing that paper, my mom, like many students, my mom, who's a former teacher, liked to read over my stuff, and I always think it was a good, you know, good thing to have a second eyes look at something. And she read the intro to that paper, and she just said, what? You actually know how to write all of a sudden. What just happened here? And I discovered that that type of writing style of investigating something and using numbers to help prove or disprove it, I learned it at Dartmouth in a way that I never learned it at any other place. And I was able to help develop the skill set of investigation tools that I use every day in my job. More than that, I would argue, you know, I started my blog here and I got credit for it. And finally, I'd add, obviously, from the statistical angle, you know, I learned a lot about statistics and learned about stats programs, Gov10, Gov19. We worked on some stuff together. So, you know, I thought it was fairly good. But I'll finally add, just in terms, I said, the room to breathe earlier, is the way that, you know, the course structure we have a lot of free time in between classes here. And I think if you're a motivated student, then that's all you can possibly ask for, right? Look, we can only hold students' hands for so long. Eventually, they're either going to sink or swim on their own. And this is a place, though, where if you're willing to swim, it gives you the chance to.
Right behind you, standing up against the wall? Yeah.
We'll get to that in a second.
So I'm wondering if you see any demographic shifts in the next 2-4 years that you think will be meaningful one way or the other.
For elections, I assume, not for moviegoing.
Well, we'll start with elections.
You know, before this election, I think there was this grand idea held in Democratic circles. This grand idea that as the country was becoming more diverse, Democrats can't lose. Because we're winning minority voters and non-white voters, the country's becoming more diverse, bada bing, bada boom. Well, that theory ran into a little hole, or a little traffic, at least. Some might say it crashed and burned. Why? What happened? What didn't we take into account? Well, it turns out that the majority of this country is still white non-Hispanic. It turns out that there's still a lot of white voters without a college degree. And what we need to recognize is that even as this country is becoming more diverse, the Democrats' ability to capitalize on that is only as good as their ability to hold on to white voters. It's also only as good as their ability to still get the same percentage of non-white voters. And if you look at the election results from this past time around, what you in fact see is, number one, Democrats lost ground among white voters. Number two, black turnout was down in a number of key states. I mean, and not only was it down, they also did worse among black voters. So one of my favorite examples is, you look at the state of Pennsylvania, there were all these precincts that before the election that Donald Trump was arguing there had to have been voter fraud because they won 100-0 for Barack Obama over Mitt Romney in 2012. Now that idea was ridiculous if you've ever been to Philadelphia and interviewed some of the voters there. But if you look at the final results, instead of Hillary Clinton winning those precincts 100 to 0 or 100% to 0%, she was winning them 94% to 6%. Still a wide, very wide margin. But it kind of got sliced and cut across the board, and you start adding up those little pieces, and all of a sudden that's a big deal. So I don't know exactly what's going to happen, but the idea that we're becoming a more diverse nation, that necessarily is good news for Democrats, I don't buy that at all. What I do think will be very interesting to watch going into the 2018 midterms, which I think I mentioned in class earlier that we did today, was that I am interested in these southern cities, or these suburbs of these southern cities, places around Dallas, places around Atlanta, places that have historically leaned more right than left, but where Donald Trump didn't do well at all. For instance, Pete Sessions' district in Texas, in Dallas, or the Dallas suburbs, which was won by Hillary Clinton, which was shocking. The Democrats, I don't believe, ran a House candidate against Pete Sessions. They didn't. Let this be a lesson, folks. You can only win if you run a candidate. And so I'm interested in these places in particular, these well-educated white districts where Hillary Clinton did well in 2016. Can Democrats do well in 2018 in those districts? That to me is a very important thing. If they can, that provides them at least somewhat of a pathway back to a majority, even if they lose these white voters without college degree districts.
Question. Yeah, back.
I believe you mentioned a moment ago, referred to yourself, your organization, the Smart Guys from New York. I'm wondering if the overall dismal performance of the punditry class in 2016 has something to do with that. That it's a bunch of smart guys in New York and Washington who rarely, if ever, get west of the Hudson or west of the Potomac. And the people they talk to and think about with are all the same folks. And they really don't know what's going on in much of the country, but hold forth like they have all of the answers.
Sure. I think it's a great question. And I should point out that I did, in fact, date a girl who was at West Point for a while, so that's just west of the Hudson, so I have made it west of the She broke my heart. In any event, yeah, I think in the primary that's especially the case. So when I think of the Republican base, right, before 2016, I think of religious voters, I think of mainstream conservative voters, perhaps, the types that would be represented by, say, a Mitt Romney or Rob Portman. And I think of the more moderate liberal people who I think kind of exist right in this space, right up and down the Connecticut River Valley. People who might vote for John Kasich in a primary, for example. And those were the three groups that I thought. Well, before, as any of the polls come out, I look and I say, okay, I talk to each of these groups, and none of them seem to be really Donald Trump-leaning groups. Oh, so then, Donald Trump will sing. What we didn't recognize was that Donald Trump's strength was not about any of those groups. It was not, he wasn't doing particularly well with one. He was doing about average with all of them. Where his strength lied was with white voters without a college degree and rural voters. Now, most of the ruralness is covered by the white non-college, but not all of it. Even when you control for education levels, it's still a matter of whether or not you live in a big city, a suburb, or a small town rural area. And I do think that at least in the primary when we were judging things, we in fact missed that. And more than that, I would argue that when we all have biases. Now I'm not necessarily talking about biases left or right or Democrat or Republican. We have biases in terms of if we believe something, then we're going to continue to try and believe it, and we're always going to look for evidence that confirms our biases in the first place. And when it comes to Donald Trump, I think all of our biases to start out with was he doesn't have much of a shot. And then we're talking with everybody, and this confirms that we're not going to go and look for anybody else, because it confirms it and so on and so forth. So I do think that that was certainly part of it. Now, I will point out, of course, that a number of the people who supposedly got this right, I won't name names, but they know it. But the people who said, oh, Donald Trump has a real shot, the people I'm talking with, so on and so forth, these were the same people who were arguing that Mitt Romney had a real shot. And that didn't turn out to be right. So, you know, I'm hesitant to go too far the other way, but I will say that I definitely think that was part of it, was that we weren't necessarily talking with the right folk, not necessarily in terms of polling, but in terms of figuring out or confirming or perhaps falsifying our preconceived notions of what was happening. Great audience, by the way. You should all take yourself out for ice cream.
Your treat. I'm actually from Philadelphia. I'm a campaign manager. I ran 3 first-time candidates over the last 5 cycles. Polling, that dictates everything when raising money. How do pollsters regain trust right back, and how do they deliver better samples? Because I think a large, you hear in the echo chamber that a lot of the samples there wasn't enough non-college whites, essentially, right?
Yeah.
In my neighborhood, the ward that I live in is one of the only 2 wards that Trump won, and racism's alive and well, and it's blue-collar middle class. It's largely union, it's largely cops and firemen. So how do you make polling better? Because I can't raise money without good polling. No one takes you seriously without good numbers.
Sure.
And how do you make better samples? I guess, obviously you're modeling, but what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I would say a few things. Number one, you should know, if you don't know, that Hillary Clinton's own internal campaign polls showed pretty much the same thing as the public polls showed. So it's not like they had special data that all of a sudden we were shocked with. At the same time, if you talk with Fabrizio, who was the pollster for Donald Trump, Tony Fabrizio, he himself thought that Hillary Clinton had a better chance of winning the election than Donald Trump did. So this was something that happened across the board. I think in terms of regaining trust, there are a number of things that can be done. Number one, do better. The best way that you can prove that you deserve the respect and the readability, or people should read you or trust your numbers, is to show them a track record. And the only way you can do that is by actually going out and polling. In terms of poll weights in particular, this might get a little nerdy, but I think that, pollsters have to be very careful of their preconceived notions of what to weight to, right? If you can tell me what the electorate is going to look like, then I'm going to probably be able to get you a pretty good sample. And I think that a lot of pollsters perhaps didn't know what the electorate was going to look like. So Patrick Ruffini, who was a Republican digital guy, was sort of mapping out with the voter files, that is, these are voter files that tell you whether or not somebody voted, the registered voter, so on and so forth, versus the turnout, expected turnout, the turnout scores that they produced. We saw that black voters, specifically young black voters, were far less likely to turn out than expected. Independent voters, young independent voters, were far less likely to turn out than expected. And the question is, what can we do to help improve upon that? I think one of the things that we might have to do is not have these preconceived notions of who's going to turn out. We need to have different levels of turnout models, different ways that this might turn out, and not be so focused on getting the one right answer, but perhaps having different answers within that, because we're not necessarily sure of what's going to happen. And then the other thing that I would really note is that we have to ensure that the samples that we have are representative of these different populations, right? We were talking about it earlier. If you're going to weight some group up, if that weighting group up is only as good as how representative they are of that vote. And I think that what we need to do is to ensure that we don't take shortcuts in polling. That is, that we ensure we are calling households 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 times if they're a tough to reach household, especially if they're in a demographic that perhaps is a lower part of the population that we normally need to weight up. Because otherwise, the people who might pick up on that first ring aren't representative of that population. And I think that absolutely happens this time around. If you speak, for instance, with Patrick Murray, who's the pollster at Monmouth, he'd tell you, my Pennsylvania poll looked pretty good geographically, except it didn't look good in rural areas. The polls were way off. Why was that? Well, it could be because the people he was weighting up simply weren't representative of the population. I'm not sure there's one perfect answer to your question, but I will say that this type of thing has happened before. Polls have been off before, and it didn't mean it was the end of polling. And in terms of the average error by state, although the error this time is a little larger than the average error, it wasn't so bad that makes me think, oh my God, holy cow. Polls are tools. They are not meant to perfectly predict. They're supposed to give you an idea of what's going to happen. And I think people have become too insistent that polls be precision perfect, when in fact they should in fact just be guides.
Let me take a poll real quick. How many of you during this last election cycle, up before the election, so anytime in 2016 before the election, received a phone call from someone who wanted to know how you were going to vote, but wasn't asking for money? Let me see your hands. All right. Now see, how many of you, when you received that phone call, the caller did not know your name and asked for the person in the household over the age of 18 who had either the first or last birthday of the calendar year? How many? So those are the people who got called by legitimate polling houses. Everybody else was being called by somebody who was getting their name off of a list, and it wasn't a legitimate poll, the kind that you would find published in the media or that 538 would do. So you know it's a poll that, first of all, they should not know your name. It's random digit dialing. And second of all, they should select someone from randomly in the household, usually by asking for the person of the age of 18 who has the most recent or last birthday in the calendar year. Now, one other poll. How many of you intentionally did not answer the phone when you thought it was a poll? Right. Here's the problem. We're being inundated by these pseudo polls that aren't really polls, that are crowding out the legitimate polls, and then many people as a result aren't answering their telephones. So we're kind of stuck where we have this self-inflicted error in polls. We want them to be accurate. We are willing to participate in their accuracy because we're being duped by pseudo polls. Questions? Yeah. Right here.
No one ever tries to call me.
I actually have a question about the team that you work with. I've followed Nate since New York Times, ESPN, for a while, but really enjoyed the podcast you guys do. I still listen to that.
Thank you.
And besides reading, I do read the site too. But I'm just wondering, what are the elements that it seems like your team works well together? Well, it seems also that there's very different people on those teams. What are the elements of that you think makes that team work so well together?
I like to think we work well together. I think we all come from at a different point, a different viewpoint, right? But more than that, what makes us work well together is we all respect one another and believe that there are different things that we have that we can offer. So, for instance, I think we all know what Nate kind of offers is this type of different mind than we normally have. I like to think that I offer sort of this encyclopedic knowledge of elections and an ability to give you a complex answer in a simplistic manner. That well put across. And I think Clara is just very good at building a narrative. She's so smart, she's such a good writer, far better than I am. And I think is much more normal than everybody else. I mean, Clara's the type of person who actually could probably talk with you versus I hate people for the most part. And so, I think that really does help. I think just these different viewpoints and respect for those different viewpoints, and that no one necessarily feels the need to get an edge word-wise. That we're willing to listen to another, and even if we disagree with one another, we're willing to respect that disagreement.
Yes, right here.
If I got a call from 538 and put my usual question when I am polled, asking who is sponsoring this poll, would you tell me?
Well, I'll say a few things. Number one, we ourselves as a company don't conduct like individual polls. I'm not going to take the Cape Air flight back to New York and then go to the office and start dialing in and calling you, though I'm sure you're very nice. What we would do is occasionally we do sponsor polls with like SurveyMonkey on individual things, so that's an online internet poll, and that you would know who we were. SurveyMonkey tells you who we are, and I believe any pollster worth their weight would tell you that we're with such and such organization. And indeed, we know, for instance, Gallup, which is the pollster that goes back all these years, actually makes it very prominent who they are, because they know that that drives up the response rate. If you're a legitimate pollster, and you're a legitimate public pollster, you want it to be known who this poll is, who it's being sponsored by, so on and so forth, because that actually helps gain you more people, helps drive up the response rate. So, even if I'm not dialing, absolutely is the answer to that question. And any news media organization that's worth their time is doing so, because they recognize that's the way to get the most accurate representation of the population possible.
I'll add that every time Dartmouth does a survey, in the very first sentence is survey sponsored by Dartmouth College. And one of the sad things about polling is that a lot of the big university polls that have been the most accurate, because they stay in the field for 2 weeks and call a number back up to 15 times to make sure they try to convert an interview, a lot of those are disappearing now because of lack of funding.
Donate.
Right here.
Thank you. A few days ago, I read one of the articles you wrote on 538. It says that Virginia Republicans are pushing for a new legislation which, if approved, will award the state's electoral votes proportionally rather than the winner-take-all system. And I remember you said that if all states follow suit, Hillary Clinton would lose to Donald Trump even if she wins the nationwide popular vote by 5%.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, sure. So essentially what occurred, and I don't think this bill's actually going to get passed overall, it was in Virginia, a subcommittee of the Assembly, the House of Delegates, the lower house of the Virginia State Legislature, a committee there approved a motion that would assign the electoral votes proportionately so that the winner of each congressional district in that state would win one electoral vote for every district they won, and then the statewide winner would win an additional 2 votes. So Hillary Clinton won 5 of the congressional districts in Virginia, despite winning statewide by about 5 percentage points. And Donald Trump would have won 6, because he won 6 congressional districts. So Clinton would have won 7 overall, and Trump 6. And this is an idea that's been floated across a number of states, at least going back to 2012, where Republican state legislatures will say, we want to pass a bill that allows for the electoral votes in that state to be divided proportionally so that the winners of each congressional district gets 1 electoral vote, and then the winner statewide gets an additional 2. That's a system that's in place in Maine and Nebraska. The problem is that the way that the congressional district lines are drawn right now, there are more Republican districts than there are Democratic districts. So that Hillary Clinton won 205 districts, while Donald Trump won 230 congressional districts, despite the fact that obviously Hillary Clinton got more votes nationwide than Donald Trump did. And so the real thing, though, as this article gets at, is that more than there just being more Republican districts than Democratic districts, most of these Republican districts are far more Republican than the nation as a whole is. Okay? So the article was essentially saying that if, say, we shifted each district 3 points more to the right, or to the left, more Democratic than it was in the election. And so that would make, obviously, Hillary Clinton win nationwide by 2, so we shift everything over 3. It's a 5-point margin. If everything was shifted to the left by 3 points, Hillary Clinton still would have lost with this system whereby each state awarded its votes by congressional district. So that's why that type of system that Virginia, at least in the subcommittee, passed, and that Republicans in other states have tried to pass, would very much benefit Republicans, at least under the current district lines and the current ways in which people are populated, Democrats specifically in urban areas.
Do you have any lessons from spending all this time talking about database predictions that could be applied to other data sciences, and especially kind of climate science?
Well, I would say a few things. Number one, be very clear about your confidence intervals. Be very clear how much uncertainty there is in your prediction. Climate science is obviously one where sometimes more people are clearer about the uncertainty. You know, we expect it to rise X number of degrees Celsius, so on and so forth. And some people are less clear, and I think that sometimes gets people into trouble insofar as, you know, certain groups perhaps want to take the most upper range, while the lower range it's still of rising would be tremendous, but then it doesn't rise as much as the upper range, and then someone who doesn't believe that man is causing climate change, or at least contributing to it, will take that and run with that and say, see, their math is completely off. But I think that that is something that generally runs throughout. And I think that we need to be very clear that we shouldn't be thinking of things in binomials, yes or no. We should be thinking about things as probabilities and percentages of things that are occurring. We should be thinking about things in terms of confidence intervals. And I don't think we do enough of that in a whole bunch of different things. Perhaps part of that is because people just don't want to think of things that way. But you know what? People, wanted to think of that the New York Yankees were going to win the 2004 ALCS, and then they didn't end up winning that way because the Boston Red Sox proved that that was the incorrect way to think about that series. So to me, we can, through the actions that we do, if we continue to push something, right? If we continue to push some idea upon that this is a different way of thinking, then even if we can't convince everyone of this way of thinking, we can perhaps convince enough people that they start thinking of something in a new way, and I think that that way of thinking about it is a far better way.
Let me give you an example that might resonate with the students in here. So I talked about this in Gov 19 class Terry took a few years ago. Some of you might be in it now. The relationship between SAT scores and GPAs among Dartmouth students. So there should be a positive relationship if you guys had to pay the College Board to take a test that's supposed to predict your academic performance, and that Dartmouth uses to try to screen students to come to Dartmouth. So if you predict a GPA based on SAT scores, you get an R score of about 0.2. It explains about 20% of the variation in GPAs. It's statistically significant. Every 100 points on a 1,600-point scale on your SAT is associated with a GPA increase of about 11 hundredths of a point. So say from a 3.4 to a 3.51, and you think, wow, that SAT really works. But here's the confidence interval associated with the SAT. It's plus or minus 0.5 of a point. That means if your prediction, your SAT predicts that your GPA at Dartmouth would be the median Dartmouth GPA of about 3.4, we're 95% confident it's between a 2.9 and a 3.9. All of a sudden, the SAT doesn't sound like a very good predictor of how a student does in school, does it? Right? So that's the kind of thing that you have to express to people, that confidence interval, which even on something that we think of as scientifically valid, you have to pay a lot of money for, that SAT isn't as good a predictor as you might think. Yeah, there's a microphone here, right there.
On the 538 website, it states that the algorithm for election prediction hasn't changed much since the 2008 election up till the 2016 election. So I was wondering if the results of this most recent presidential election will prompt the analysts like you or the others at 538 to modify the algorithms.
I said it earlier and I'll say it again. I think we really have to look very hard in the primary season and help improve upon that, to help develop a true forecast for the entire primary. But in terms of the general election, I really am not, I'm fairly happy with the product, the end product. I don't think that there is a real way that you could have looked at that polling data that was produced by the polling organizations and seen anything but Hillary Clinton being a favorite to win the presidency. I think it's a matter of the confidence interval, and I think we did a better job than most of that. But look, I said it once, I'll say it 1,000 times. You'll flip a coin twice in the air, it's going to land on heads twice, 25% of the time. That, to me, if we have Donald Trump at a 30% chance of winning, I'm okay with that. I really am. Perhaps we can do a better job of explaining what that probability is. But I think, obviously, at the end of any election, you look and you think, okay, these pollsters are better than this, so we'll adjust that, this, that, another. But the raw baseline of that model, no, I don't think that's going to change very much.
Yeah, right here.
I hope you're going to know what I'm talking about because I don't remember the details, but the professor at American University who completely predicted that Trump was going to win, who scared me very early on because he had this particular criteria that he used. Can you talk about those?
Yeah, I can talk about that. Look, I'm sure Alan's a nice guy. That's where you know where I'm going now. Alan Lichtman uses these keys to the White House, like are we in war, is there a major independent bid, and so on and so forth, and there's 13 of them. And if 8 of them are positive, or 7 of them are positive or something, it means that the incumbent party is going to win. And if 8 of them are negative, it means the opposition party is going to win. Well, I don't particularly think much of those keys, no offense to Professor Lichtman, but more than that, he has to make up his mind. He has to determine whether or not he's interested in predicting the popular vote or the electoral college vote. Because his model, which supposedly predicted all these elections, predicted that Al Gore was going to win in 2000. And he claimed victory because obviously Al Gore won the popular vote. Well, in this particular election, if he is going to claim victory once again, then he's changed the rules of the game in the middle, because obviously Donald Trump didn't win the popular vote. And more than that, I think a lot of those keys are very subjective. Like a major third-party bid, no one got above 3%, or what Gary Johnson get, 3 point what? 3 point something. That's not a major third-party bid as far as I'm concerned. I mean, Gary Johnson's a nice guy. I met him. Seemed reasonable. Seemed like someone that if I was interested in having an interesting brownie, I'd want to have it with him. But, you know, it's not a major third-party thing. You know, so, you know, no, I didn't think very much of it. But I will say, to broaden this out a little bit, there are fundamental-based models, like what's the state of the economy? How's the economy doing? How's GDP? How's income growth? How's the unemployment rate? How are changes in the unemployment rate? Jobs, so on and so forth. We had a fundamental-based model that was part of the 538 forecast, as part of our polls plus. And if you look at the line, just based upon our economic indices, we showed a close race going all along. I had an article that was entitled, "The more normal Trump can make this race, the better off he'll be, or the better chance he'll have of winning." And that showed a very close race, and it ended up being that the outcome of this race was very close to the fundamentals, which based upon the economy suggested a close race, and that's exactly what we got.
What was the mood like in the 538 headquarters on election night, and how did that change?
Well, I was so exhausted at that particular point in time that I'm not sure that my mood was anything other than I need another Diet A&W cream soda right now. God bless that company making cream soda that has caffeine in it. In terms of the actual mood, I would say that I would follow up on an answer that I gave earlier, which was we understood, you know, that there was a real shot that Donald Trump was going to win. But understanding that mathematically is different than truly conceptualizing it and internalizing it. And when the first few results came in, you know, we got the early exit polls, which suggested that Hillary Clinton was going to win. There were the first few results, you know, from counties perhaps that we looked at were pretty decent for Hillary Clinton. And to have that, and then all of a sudden, as more results came in and recognizing, wait a minute, something's not right here in terms of what we expected to necessarily happen, I think the mood turned more into a real surprise. Like, wow, this is really happening. I can't believe that this is happening. This guy is going to win. And obviously, there are some people at a particular website who might be more in favor than one candidate or another, and that perhaps comes across. But I think the big thing was more surprise in terms of like, not surprised, like, wow, we didn't think this was there was no way this was gonna happen. It was more, wow, we're gonna have a president of the United States whose name is Donald John Trump, who went down an escalator in 2015 and, you know, went into these debates and said things that we'd never heard before, but apparently it connected with people in places that we perhaps weren't part of. So I would think more surprise, more like, wow, it's a general mood.
We're down front.
So I have two questions. First of all, have you polled your readership, and do you know who reads your media outlet mainly? And
Lots of people.
Yeah, on the spectrum, political, economic, social.
Sure.
And then I was wondering whether you were able to look at the data published by the New York Times about colleges last week,
I
and
did.
about Dartmouth specifically.
I did see some of that data.
Yeah.
I typed it in. And yeah.
Because it's very troubling to me. I have like I'm an international student, so I came here, I was smacked through the face, realizing how freaking wealthy and privileged most people here are, and how much this plays into like this notion of ignorance about the surrounding world. So my question is, do you think that this college could be fertile ground for polling that might be able to kind of further expose this privilege and kind of battle ignorance, which is so prevalent?
Yeah, so I'll go with the first things first. I mean, I hinted at it before, our readership is more left of right. Our readership is probably more educated. Our readership probably is a little younger. It's probably a little bit more male. So all of those things and a little bit more urban, which you probably expect, right? Unfortunately, we're at a place right now where, you know, it's still prevalent in our society where numbers is more of a masculine thing than a feminine thing, which I think is freaking ridiculous, but the numbers are what they are. So that's basically where our readership is. I did take a look at the Times thing. This was like, I don't know if the rest of y'all read this, but it was essentially, you know, what percentage of college, you know, the people that were admitted to college meet some sort of economic bracket, and Dartmouth's percentage was, Dartmouth had a lot of wealthy people in it. And if you know, look at the incoming class at our school, you know that it's white and Asian, for, you know, compared than you might otherwise suspect, especially in the Asian film. And so, you know, I looked at those, and I think on the wealth thing, obviously, you have to recognize you're in a bubble. And if you're in New York, you have to recognize you're in a bubble. And a lot of people live in bubbles. And it's not just people here or, you know, in New York who live in bubbles. Most people in rural areas live in bubbles, too. You know, it's a bubble problem nationwide. It's not that one side is necessarily better, or somehow the people, you know, who live in the rural are living the good life or whatever, or that somehow we're more, you know, cosmopolitan and so on and so forth, and, you know, top hats and so on. You know, it's not that. We do live in bubbles. I think, you know, I'm not an administrator here. I don't speak on behalf of the school, certainly not, thank God. But I think that that's something that will need to be wrestled with. But Dartmouth isn't a state school, it's a private institution. A lot of the places that are, you know, better, you know, have more diversity in terms of its income are state institutions. So they obviously have a leg up. But that's something that should be discussed. I think it's, obviously there are all different types of diversity that should be discussed. No place I think can ever be too diverse. But I do think that sometimes some parts of diversity are emphasized more than others. I'm not necessarily sure that income diversity is spoken about nearly enough in enough places.
Let me add a plug for data science, which is that we wouldn't have known about this had the New York Times not gathered the data and published it. And now we know which colleges are overrepresented among the top 1%, underrepresented among the top bottom 40 or 50% of the income distribution. And now we're informed, and we can try to do something about it, whereas we were uninformed with the facts before.
Although I should note it was a third party that almost gave it to us, but went with the Times instead. Legion.
I think we have time for one final
question.
Right there next to you.
Thank you. I was just wondering what you think. I've been reading a bit about news in like some presidential elections that are happening in Europe, for example.
Yeah,
and
in France.
And like France, for example, Germany, and like you see some candidates themselves being emboldened and saying like, don't trust the polls. What do you think of this idea kind of spreading around, like not with Brexit before Trump, like after Trump and in Europe?
Well, I tell you, look, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing that people don't trust the polls, as long as the polls are still being published and the pollsters are still getting paid. I think if anything, then the idea that there isn't a certain outcome and that people have to go out and vote unsure of what the result's going to be is probably a good thing. I do wonder, I mean, it does get in your mind a little bit that if people perhaps were a little less certain of the outcome in 2012 and 2016, that maybe they felt too certain of it and didn't go out and vote, and maybe, you know, things might have turned out a little bit differently had they been a little less certain about it. I'm not necessarily sure that the polls had everything to do with that. I think it also had to do with a whole bunch of other factors. But no, I am going to be quite interested in the French election for president and the German, you know, parliamentary elections for chancellor. I'm going to be quite interested to see how those types of things turn out. And I will say that, you know, sometimes polls get things wrong, and especially as races are close. And more than that, when there are a lot of candidates running, that's when the polls can really have haywire, where people are jumping in between candidates at the last minute. First round in France, for instance, France has a 2-round system whereby, you know, everyone runs in the first round and then no one gets 50, then you hold a runoff afterwards. I'm going to be very interested to see how the polls perform in that particular election. And I think it's going to be a really interesting test case. And Marine Le Pen is a very interesting candidate. Her father obviously had run before and, you know, had lost it, but she is a little bit more moderate than he is, a little bit, you know, less on the far right. I'm going to be very interested to see whether or not the opposition can rally around one particular candidate after Le Pen probably scoots by in the first round, either in first or second place.
So I get the last question.
Oh,
We
you
come
do.
back and do this again sometime, maybe before the 2018 midterms or at some point.
You know, as long as Cape Air continues to fly that lovely little plane that they fly. Still my favorite thing is I'm a huge 90s sitcom fan. So if you don't know this, one of the planes, at least as of a few years ago in the Cape Air fleet, was the plane that was used in the beginning of the television show Wings. And so I remember the time I was told that I was getting along the plane, I was getting on the Wings plane. All the other students had no idea what was going on, but I tell you, that not only made my day, not my week, but my month. So, sure, why not?
Great. Well, thank you very much.